It was one of those autumn afternoons when the Smoky Mountains looked almost unreal, hazy light filtering through the thinning canopy, the air heavy with that mix of rain and pine that always meant the season was changing. On October 23, 2005, 17-year-old Lila Mercer parked her small silver Honda Civic at the Deep Creek trailhead just outside Bryson City, North Carolina. The air temperature hovered around 60 degrees. A storm system was moving in from the west, but the rain hadn't started yet. She zipped her blue flannel jacket, slung her hiking pack over one shoulder, and paused to send a final text to her best friend. 2-hour hike, be back before dark. It was 2:43 p.m. Lila wasn't new to the woods. She'd grown up spending summers camping with her parents in the Great Smoky Mountains. Her mother, Caroline, had passed away the year before from a sudden stroke, and hiking had become her way to cope, a place to be quiet and away from the noise of her grief. Her father, Daniel Mercer, said later that hiking was the only time she seemed calm again. The Deep Creek Trail wasn't considered dangerous. It was moderate, looping through dense hemlock and rhododendron before cutting up toward Indian Creek Falls. She'd done it many times before, often alone, always signing her name neatly in the small green trail register near the parking lot. That afternoon, her name was there again. L. Mercer. 2:30 p.m. As she started up the path, a few other hikers were coming down. One couple remembered her passing with a polite nod, earbuds in, dark hair tied back, boots splashed with mud from the morning rain. They said she looked confident, relaxed, like someone who belonged out there. By 4 o'clock, the weather began to turn. Clouds rolled in faster than expected, and mist started to settle in the valley. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in less than an hour. By 5, fog had swallowed the ridgelines completely, making the trail appear darker than it should have been that early in the evening. At 6:15, when she still hadn't come home, her father called her cell phone twice. It went straight to voicemail. By 8:02, he was standing at the trailhead himself, headlights cutting through drizzle. Her car still parked in the same spot where she'd left it. The doors were locked. Inside, her phone lay face down on the passenger seat, charger still coiled neatly in the cup holder. He tried to convince himself she might have gone out for dinner with friends, maybe no signal, maybe her battery had died. But as the rain picked up and the forest went completely dark, that rationalization collapsed. He called 911 at 9:18 p.m. The first ranger arrived 20 minutes later. They found her entry in the logbook, confirmed her direction on the trail, and began a quick sweep with headlamps. Visibility was poor, less than 20 feet. The rain turned steady, washing away whatever faint tracks might have been left in the mud. The search ramped up quickly. Rangers, volunteer hikers, even 2 K9 units were brought in overnight. But by dawn, they had nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no sign she'd ever left the trail at all. The only clue was her father's account of how meticulous she'd been. She always left notes, always checked in. She hated being late, and she wasn't impulsive. As the hours passed, searchers began widening their radius. The terrain there is steep, carved by creeks and ravines that can swallow sound. One ranger later said that shouting her name felt like yelling into a sponge. The fog just ate the noise. By the next afternoon, the weather had worsened. A cold front pushed in from the north, bringing gusts that tore leaves from the trees and filled the valleys with swirling mist. It was the kind of weather that disorients even veteran hikers. They combed the main loop first, then the feeder trails, marking grids with orange tape. Search dogs caught a brief scent along a narrow switchback halfway up the ridge, but it vanished near a runoff channel filled with wet leaves. As night fell again, Daniel refused to leave. He stayed by her car, leaning against the hood under a tarp, eyes fixed on the tree line. Rangers told him they'd resume at first light. He nodded but didn't move. By the third day, the fog lifted enough for a helicopter sweep. From above, the forest looked endless, a patchwork of green and brown broken only by the glint of creek water. Nothing stood out. Late that afternoon, a ranger named Calder Boone noticed something unusual along a slope about half a mile off the marked path. A single boot print, pressed into damp soil. They photographed it, measured it size 7, same as Lila's, but there were no others leading to or from it. The print was angled toward a steep drop, where the ground fell away sharply into a ravine choked with brush. At the edge, the soil was disturbed, as if someone had slipped or stopped suddenly. They rappelled down carefully, expecting to find torn fabric, a piece of gear, something. But the ravine bottom was clean. No debris, no sign of anyone ever falling through. Back at the ridge, fog began to rise again, rolling like smoke through the pines. Daniel watched the rangers emerge one by one, shaking their heads. He stared at the boot print, unable to speak, his face pale in the fading light. Somewhere out there, his daughter had stepped off the trail and vanished. And as darkness spread across the Smoky Mountains that night, only one question echoed among the searchers. Why did the footprints stop there? By dawn, the search for 17-year-old Lila Mercer had become the largest mobilization the park had seen in years. Rangers, deputies, K-9 units, and nearly 100 volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder across the mist-soaked field near the trailhead. Radios crackled, dogs barked, and beyond the line of trees, the sound of running water echoed faintly through the fog. The air temperature had dropped overnight to 42 degrees, and light rain fell steadily, just enough to make the ground slick and erase most of the previous day's footprints. Search Command was set up in a temporary tent near the ranger station. On the wall inside hung a laminated topographic map of the Deep Creek drainage area, with red marker lines dividing the terrain into search grids. Every 15 minutes, teams checked in, giving their coordinates, wind direction, and visibility status. Rangers used what's known as the scent cone theory, trying to predict where Lila's scent might travel based on prevailing winds and temperature gradients. But the rain made it nearly impossible. Wet air pushes scent down, dispersing it unevenly, and within hours, both K-9 units began to lose interest. By noon, the first helicopter was airborne. It circled low over the valley, infrared sensors scanning for any heat source larger than a raccoon. Searchers hoped she might have found a shelter and overhang, a hunter's blind, an old cabin. But the screens showed nothing, just endless forest, cold and uniform. Meanwhile, volunteers on the ground pushed deeper along the main trail. The woods were quiet except for their voices calling her name over and over. Lila, Lila Mercer. Each shout vanished into the thick air. No echo, no response. At 2:30 p.m., a ranger named Boone, the same one who'd found the single boot print, noticed something in the brush about 400 yards off the main path. It was a dark shape half covered in leaves, resting against a mossy log. When he brushed it off, he saw it was a backpack, light, gray, small, and half unzipped. Inside were a rain jacket, trail mix, an unopened map of the park, and a disposable camera. Everything looked dry and intact, as though it had been set down, not dropped. The only thing missing was a water bottle from one of the side pouches. The pack's location didn't make sense. It was far from the main trail, across uneven terrain. To reach that point, she would have had to leave the marked path and descend through dense brush, a move that no experienced hiker would make willingly, especially with weather closing in. Investigators flagged the site and expanded the grid downhill. The slope there was steep and muddy, leading toward an old, overgrown roadbed that hadn't appeared on modern maps. Later research showed it was part of a maintenance route that had been closed since 1998 after a landslide cut it off. It was technically outside the designated search area, but footprints nearby suggested movement in that direction. By the second night, morale was already slipping. The cold intensified, and volunteers worked under headlamps, their breath visible in the air. Rangers set up checkpoints and rotated teams in 6-hour shifts. Search dogs were reintroduced the following morning, but each one lost scent at roughly the same place right near where her backpack had been found. Back at the command tent, her father waited, wrapped in a park-issued blanket, eyes fixed on the digital map that tracked the teams. He hadn't slept more than an hour since she disappeared. He refused to leave, telling rangers he'd stay until she was found. They brought him coffee, tried to reassure him, but each passing hour made that promise harder to sustain. The third morning, a brief burst of sunlight gave the team new hope. They restarted helicopter sweeps, adding drone coverage in tighter areas. One drone operator reported seeing something reflective along a ridgeline, but when a team hiked out, it turned out to be a crushed soda can. False alarms like that happened constantly. Bright moss mistaken for fabric, fallen branches that looked like clothing from the air. By day 4, the media had arrived. Satellite trucks lined the gravel turnout below the ranger station. Reporters clustered under umbrellas, filming live segments about the mystery of the missing teen hiker. Some networks speculated she might have run away. Others hinted at darker theories suggesting she'd staged her disappearance. None of them had met her father, who sat just a few yards away listening to their voices echo through the rain. He refused to speak on camera. Inside the park, searchers kept pushing outward. They covered over 20 square miles of terrain in the first 72 hours. When they weren't in the field, they huddled in tents, maps spread over tables, arguing about probabilities. One ranger believed she'd followed the creek downstream, trying to reach the old road. Another thought she might have doubled back and gotten turned around on the ridge. The conditions were brutal. Hypothermia warnings were issued for searchers. Rain soaked every layer of clothing, radios malfunctioned, and mudslides blocked access to several sections of trail. At night, generators hummed beside the tents, while thermal scanners flickered with static interference. On the 5th day, the weather finally cleared. For a few hours, the mountains stood sharp and blue under the sun. From above, helicopters could see clear to the valley floor, where early snowmelt had carved shallow gullies through the undergrowth. Teams focused there, hoping runoff might expose something: a shoe, a strap, a scrap of fabric. That afternoon, they did find something. 2 partial footprints pressed into clay at the edge of a small clearing. The pattern matched the same tread as Lila's hiking boots. But again, they stopped suddenly, with no continuation in any direction. It was as if she'd walked a few paces and vanished. The discovery reignited rumors. Some locals whispered about missing person clusters, about people disappearing into the mountains. Rangers dismissed it as superstition, but quietly, even the most seasoned among them admitted they couldn't explain the patterns. By day 7, fatigue began to show. Volunteers dropped out. Funding for overtime hours ran thin. Command had to start prioritizing where to send limited personnel. Statistically, survival chances after a full week in those conditions were near zero. The conversations inside the tent shifted from "when we find her" to "if we find her." Her father still came every morning, his face drawn and pale, asking for updates. The rangers started avoiding eye contact when he approached. On day 9, he stood silently near the tree line while a final helicopter sweep took off. Its rotor wash whipped through the wet leaves, sending a cold spray over him. They gave it one last full day. Teams combed every drainage, every ravine, marking off squares on the grid map with red grease pencil. No new evidence surfaced. Not a single piece of clothing, not even a broken branch suggesting struggle or fall. Just silence and mist. On the 10th evening, the search was officially suspended. The announcement came quietly, just after sunset. The rangers didn't make a scene. They simply folded, picked up the maps, logged coordinates, and began packing their equipment. The press called it an unresolved disappearance, and within days, the headlines faded. Daniel Mercer stayed behind as the tents came down. He stood at the trailhead beside her car, now covered with a thin film of pine needles and rainwater. In the distance, the last helicopter lifted off, its blades cutting through low gray cloud. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it was gone entirely, leaving only the hush of wind through the trees. He whispered her name once, just to hear how it sounded in the quiet. It didn't echo. It just disappeared into the woods like she had. Years passed, but Deep Creek never forgot her. Even after the official search ended, hikers and locals kept talking about the girl who'd vanished there. The story lingered like fog over the valley, never seen, but always felt. Rangers said that once a place has a tragedy, it gets a kind of reputation. People walk through it differently. They lower their voices. They notice things they wouldn't have noticed before. By 2007, 2 years after Lila Mercer disappeared, that stretch of trail had changed. Signs went up warning hikers not to venture off the marked paths. The old maintenance road she'd supposedly followed was sealed off completely, but still, stories began to spread. Campers swore they'd seen a flicker of firelight deep in the trees at night, too far off trail for anyone to be camping there legally. Others said they'd heard a woman's voice calling faintly during storms, echoing across the valley like someone yelling for help from underwater. Rangers dismissed it as imagination. Fog, thunder, wind, through the hollows, it can make sounds, play tricks on people. Still, the reports came in every few months, always near the same stretch of deep creek. One couple described catching a glimpse of blue flannel between the trees, moving uphill and then vanishing. They said it was so vivid they started calling her name before realizing how quiet the woods had become. Online, the story took on a life of its own. Early forums and hiking message boards picked it apart, comparing her disappearance to other vanishings in the park. Amateur sleuths mapped coordinates, theorized about sinkholes, wild animals, even hidden caves. Some threads drew eerie parallels to other missing persons, same age range, same conditions, always near water, fog, or sudden weather changes. The Park Service refused to comment publicly, calling it online speculation. Meanwhile, Lila Mercer never stopped coming back. Every October, on the anniversary of her disappearance, he drove from Knoxville to Deep Creek, parking in the same gravel lot where her car had once sat. He'd place a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the trailhead sign, Mountain Asters, her favorite, and a folded note tucked beneath a rock. No one ever read those notes, but rangers found them year after year, replaced each time with a new one. By 2015, most of the rangers who'd worked her case had retired or transferred. The only people who remembered it firsthand were a few locals and one retired search coordinator who still lived nearby. He kept the old files in a plastic storage bin in his garage, weathered maps, faded evidence labels, and pages of handwritten notes from the first 10 days of the search. He told an interviewer once, "There were things about that case that didn't fit. You don't just vanish like that, not that close to a road." That same year, a new ranger named Evan Thorne transferred into the park from Montana. He was 32, quiet, methodical, and had a reputation for noticing patterns others missed. He came across Lila's case by accident, while reviewing old missing person reports for an unrelated project on trail safety. What caught his eye wasn't just the circumstances of her disappearance, but the location. The coordinates of Deep Creek overlapped with 3 other unsolved cases going back to the late 1980 seconds. All involved hikers who had vanished under foggy or stormy conditions, none more than a few miles apart. 2 of them were eventually found, one deceased from exposure, another injured but alive after days lost in a ravine. The rest remained missing. Evan began piecing together what he could from the archives. He noticed something subtle but consistent. Each disappearance happened during a period of sudden weather change, fast-moving cold fronts that brought fog and temperature drops. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was enough to raise questions. Why did the same conditions keep showing up? And why were there no follow-up reports for Lila after the first 72 hours? He reached out to retired rangers who'd been there during the 2005 search. Most gave vague recollections, just bad weather, poor visibility, no leads. But one mentioned something Evan hadn't seen in the files. A tourist had turned in a lost camera to the ranger station in the summer of 2007, found near Deep Creek, not far from the closed service road. It was supposedly sent to evidence but never logged properly. Sometimes, digging into one mystery uncovers another. While reviewing those old case files, Evan came across a 1995 report from rural Tennessee, a 10-year-old girl who disappeared walking home from school. The family's story was strange even then, but what surfaced 14 years later was almost impossible to believe. If you haven't seen that investigation, it's linked in the description. Watch it after this one, because the truth that family hid for more than a decade might change the way you see cases like Lila Mercer's. Evan checked the property inventory. Sure enough, there it was, tagged under miscellaneous items, reference number 07 to 326, a Polaroid one-step camera with a cracked casing and a half-used film cartridge inside. The note said it had been found under brush, possibly weathered. The film had never been developed. He took the item to the evidence room. The label was smudged, almost unreadable, but he could make out one word on the tag: creek. It had been sitting in a bin for nearly a decade, untouched. The idea that it might hold anything relevant to a missing person case from years earlier seemed impossible. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that this might be connected. That night, he went home and started reading everything he could find about Lila Mercer. Old news articles, archived forum posts, missing person flyers, scanned and uploaded by strangers. The same black and white photo appeared everywhere, her smiling softly, wind blowing her hair, blue flannel visible at her shoulders. He couldn't explain why the case bothered him more than the others. Maybe it was the details, the precision of her disappearance, how it defied logic. Maybe it was her father's persistence, visiting every year like the story wasn't finished yet. Whatever it was, Evan felt that quiet itch that investigators know too well, the sense that something's been overlooked. He brought the camera to a forensic contact in Asheville the next week to test if any film could still be processed. The technician told him it was possible, though unlikely after all that time. But before he left the lab, Evan asked one more question: what kind of images could survive under those conditions? The technician shrugged and said, "Sometimes a few frames hold up, sometimes nothing at all." He nodded, thanked him, and walked out, the small camera in his hand. Outside, the air was heavy and gray, just like it had been on the day she disappeared. Back at his cabin that evening, Evan laid the case file on his kitchen table. The pages were yellowed, edges curled, still smelling faintly of damp paper. He looked over the search maps, her last known coordinates, and the ranger notes from that first week. His pen hovered above the map, drawing a small circle where her backpack had been found. He realized then that every sighting, every rumor, every ghost story from Deep Creek seemed to cluster within a half-mile radius of that same area. The closed road, the creek bend, the slope where the print had ended. He didn't know what he'd find if the photos developed. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But for the first time in years, someone inside the park system was looking again. And inside a small evidence locker, sealed in a plastic bag, a weathered Polaroid camera waited, its film still undeveloped, its secrets still trapped in chemical silence. When the first images appeared, the room went silent. The Polaroid film had survived better than anyone expected. After nearly a decade sealed in a bag, 3 faint photographs emerged from the chemical bath, grainy, tinted yellow with age, but intact. The first was simple, a patch of forest canopy, branches intersecting against the pale October sky. It was the kind of picture hikers take without thinking, maybe testing at the light. Evan studied it for a long time, tracing the patterns of leaves, the faint blur of motion near the edge. Nothing unusual, just trees and a sliver of sunlight. The second photograph was sharper. It showed a pair of hiking boots mud-streaked, positioned near a creek bed. A blue flannel sleeve was visible at the bottom of the frame, the cuff folded slightly. The right boot was tilted, suggesting the photo had been taken quickly, maybe while she was kneeling or setting something down. Evan stared at it, realizing he was looking at the last confirmed moment of Lila Mercer's life. The third photo took his breath away. It was blurry, overexposed near the edges, but clear enough to make out Lila's silhouette facing away from the camera. She appeared to be turning slightly, as if she'd just heard something behind her. The light was low early evening, judging by the shadow angles, and in the far background, through the tangle of branches, there was a darker shape, human-sized, out of focus, but undeniably there. He asked the lab technician if it could be a double exposure, some mechanical glitch in the camera. The answer came back no. The blur wasn't from layering, it was from motion. Whoever was in the background had been moving when the shutter clicked. For the first time in 14 years, the case had something tangible, something real. Evan brought the photos to the park's investigative office in Asheville. There, they went through official procedures, chain of custody, photographic authentication, and DNA testing. When results came back a week later, they confirmed what he already suspected. Skin cells lifted from the camera strap matched the original DNA sample taken from Lila's hairbrush in 2005. It was hers. She had carried that camera into the woods the day she vanished. The discovery reignited the investigation. Rangers who'd long since given up on the case suddenly had something new to analyze. Specialists examined the photos, mapping the direction of light and shadows to estimate time of day. The canopy photo, based on sun angle, was likely taken between 4:30 and 5 p.m. The creek photo was minutes later, sun lower, light cooler. The final blurred image appeared to have been captured less than half an hour before dusk. If the timestamps held true, Lila was still alive well after the fog had started rolling in. Evan worked with a geospatial analyst to reconstruct her possible route. They compared terrain features visible in the photos, rock patterns, creek curvature, and a distinctive fallen tree in the background of the second shot. Using archived topographic data from 2005, they matched the location to an area about half a mile downhill from the main trail, near the same old service road that had been closed for years. That discovery changed everything. The terrain there was rugged, with dense vegetation and remnants of an old access path that had once led to a ranger cabin before it was dismantled decades earlier. Few modern maps even showed it. For all practical purposes, it was forgotten ground. The working theory was that Lila had taken a wrong turn in the fog and ended up on the old roadbed. But the photos suggested something different. She'd been calm enough to stop and take pictures. She wasn't lost, at least. Not yet. Evan reviewed the final image again, zooming in on the faint figure behind her. The person seemed to be standing just beyond the depth of focus, partially obscured by brush. Analysis showed a vertical profile consistent with a person wearing a jacket or coat. The stride angle suggested forward motion, someone walking toward her. The problem was, there were no records of any other hikers in that area that day. The trail register listed only 3 other parties, all accounted for. No one else had reported being near Deep Creek during the hours she vanished. That left 2 unsettling possibilities. Either someone had entered the park, unofficially off the books, or Lila's camera had captured a stranger who was never meant to be there. As he dug deeper into park archives, Evan discovered that illegal activity wasn't unheard of in that section of the Smokies. Over the years, rangers had found remnants of old moonshine stills, hunting blinds, and makeshift camps used by poachers. In the early 2000s, there had been a few quiet arrests connected to unlicensed hunting and trapping near the very same maintenance road. The working hypothesis began to shift. What if she'd encountered someone who didn't want to be found? Evan shared the theory with the state investigator assigned to the cold case division. Together, they revisited all witness statements from 2005. One detail that had been dismissed back then suddenly seemed more relevant. A hiker had reported hearing metallic clanging sounds near the closed road that afternoon. It was written off at the time as forestry maintenance, but maintenance logs for that date showed no crews scheduled anywhere near Deep Creek. The investigator suggested it could have been an old still site being used again, or someone cutting metal traps. Whatever it was, it meant there might have been someone out there that day, someone living or hiding deep enough in the park to avoid detection. Forensic specialists enhanced the final photo using modern digital restoration tools. The process was painstaking, pulling detail from a film that had degraded over time. The results were unsettling. Behind Lila, near the tree line, appeared a faint rectangular shape, part of a structure, maybe wood or stone. It didn't match any of the known cabins on record, but the geometry was too straight to be natural. Evan compared it to historical blueprints of the old ranger cabin built in the 1960s. The dimensions aligned. That cabin had been officially dismantled in 1999, but field notes suggested that only the roof and walls had been removed. The foundation was left to decay under the brush. That foundation sat roughly half a mile from where her backpack had been found. The pieces were starting to form a picture that was hard to ignore. She'd made it off the trail. She'd taken photos near a creek. She'd encountered someone. And then, near the remains of an abandoned cabin, everything had stopped. The new findings were enough to justify reopening the case. Search teams were quietly reassembled, smaller this time, more focused, guided by data rather than hope. They returned to the area with updated aerial maps, metal detectors, and cadaver dogs. As the teams began clearing overgrown brush near the old road, Evan walked ahead, following the contours he'd memorized from the photographs. The air was thick and humid, the kind that muffles sound. He reached a clearing and saw the faint outline of the old foundation stones under the dirt, half swallowed by moss. The coordinates matched perfectly. He stood there for a long moment, trying to imagine the scene from 14 years earlier, the fading light, the sound of the creak, the final click of a Polaroid shutter. Somewhere near that spot, something had happened that no one had seen. And for years, no one had even known how close they'd been to finding it. Evan didn't yet know what the next discovery would be, but as he looked around the empty clearing, he noticed something unsettling, a line of disturbed soil near one of the foundation stones, as if the ground had been tampered with long ago. He marked the spot quietly, stepped back, and radioed for the team. Whatever was buried there, it was waiting to be found. In the spring of 2019, 14 years after Lila Mercer disappeared, the Smoky Mountains were recovering from one of the worst winter storms in decades. Heavy winds had torn down trees and blocked off several access trails. A volunteer maintenance crew was assigned to clear debris near the old service road, the same one that had long since faded from official maps. It was supposed to be routine work. A few men with chainsaws, a ranger supervising, nothing unusual. But late one afternoon, while moving a cluster of rotted logs near the base of the slope, one of the volunteers noticed something metallic glinting in the dirt. It was small, half-buried, and rusted almost beyond recognition. When he brushed away the soil, he realized it wasn't a tool or a piece of equipment. It was a locket. The clasp had corroded shut, but the faint outline of an engraved letter L was still visible. When the ranger pried it open, the hinge cracked, revealing a faded photograph sealed behind cloudy glass. It showed a young girl, Lila, standing beside her mother, both smiling, sunlight flaring behind them. The image was old, damaged by moisture, but unmistakable. It wasn't something that could have washed in by chance. The soil around it was compacted, undisturbed, suggesting it had been deliberately placed there. The locket was sent for analysis. Soil samples taken from its surface revealed sediment layers, consistent with long-term burial years, not months. Beneath the microscope, mineral traces matched the surrounding terrain precisely, confirming it had been in that spot since around the time of Lila's disappearance. When the results came back, the Park Service contacted local authorities. The case was officially reopened. Evan Thorne, now serving as a senior ranger, was called to the scene. He knew immediately what this meant. The spot where the locket had been found was less than 30 feet from the old cabin foundation he'd investigated months earlier. The unease he'd felt standing there returned instantly. A specialized cadaver dog team was brought in from Asheville. The dogs worked the perimeter of the clearing methodically, handlers watching for subtle behavioral cues. Within minutes, one of the dogs froze near a cluster of pine roots, growing through the remnants of the foundation wall. It whined softly, then it began pawing at the ground. The other dog joined in seconds later. Both indicated the same point. Excavation began slowly. Archaeological protocol required that every inch of soil be sifted and documented. 6 inches down, they uncovered what looked like a fragment of cloth, thin, pale blue, tangled among the roots. Beneath that, the first piece of bone appeared. The excavation expanded into a grid, revealing partial skeletal remains in what had once been a shallow depression, now compacted by time and tree growth. It was a confined space, almost like a root pocket, where erosion had gradually filled in the gaps. The bones were fragile, discolored, but largely intact, enough to suggest a body had been placed there intentionally. Forensic anthropologists took over. The remains were transferred to a lab in Knoxville for analysis. Over the following weeks, specialists worked to reconstruct the sequence of events that might have led to her death. The isotopic signature of the bones was one of the first clues. Traces of oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in bone tissue can reveal the water a person drank over the last years of their life. The readings matched the municipal profile for Knoxville, Lila's hometown, confirming the remains were consistent with her origin. Further analysis revealed a healed ankle fracture, identical to one documented in her medical records when she was 13. There was no longer any doubt. It was her. The report also described two significant injuries. The first was a fracture to the femur, likely caused by a fall from height, perhaps from slipping down the embankment near the creek. But the second was far more troubling: a depressed skull fracture on the left temporal bone. Forensic pathologists determined it was caused by blunt force trauma, delivered by an object with a narrow striking surface. It was not consistent with a fall alone. This single finding changed the case from an accident to a homicide investigation. When investigators compiled the new evidence, they re-examined every name associated with park maintenance and security in 2005. One stood out: a seasonal maintenance worker named Richard Hale, who had been assigned to the Deep Creek sector during the month Lila vanished. Records showed he was the last to check the service road for structural hazards before it was closed that fall. He had since moved out of state and, according to criminal records, had been convicted of assault in 2008 after an unrelated incident. He died in 2012 from liver failure. His personnel file noted disciplinary issues, unreported absences, erratic behavior, and unauthorized presence in restricted areas. When detectives mapped his assigned patrol routes, one overlapped precisely with the section where Lila's backpack and now her remains were found. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to draw an unsettling conclusion. Investigators theorized that Lila may have encountered Hale while trying to find her way back to the trail. He was known to use the old service road for off-schedule maintenance runs, often carrying tools and working alone. If she had approached him for help, it might have seemed safe at first. Something could have gone wrong: a confrontation, a panic, or worse. The skull injury suggested violence. The deliberate burial of the locket implied someone had returned afterward, perhaps to hide or mark the site. When authorities contacted Daniel Mercer to confirm the findings, he was in his late 50s, living quietly outside Knoxville. The call came on a gray morning. He had spent every anniversary of her disappearance standing at the same trailhead, leaving flowers beneath the sign. When they told him they'd found her, he didn't speak for several seconds. Then, according to the detective who made the call, he asked one question: did she suffer? They told him the truth as gently as they could. The forensic evidence suggested she might have been injured first, possibly unconscious, when the final blow occurred. They couldn't say for certain, but the data implied it had been quick. A week later, he drove back to Deep Creek for the first time in years. Rangers had already cordoned off the area, but they allowed him a moment alone at the trailhead. He stood there quietly, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the ridge where she'd last been seen. The fog was thin that morning, lifting slowly between the trees. He left a single white rose on the wooden post and walked away. The official press conference was held 3 days later. Reporters filled the small briefing room at the Swain County Sheriff's Office. Behind the podium, investigators outlined the sequence of events that had finally brought closure to the 14-year-old mystery. They confirmed the remains were positively identified as Lila Mercer through dental and DNA records. They detailed the locket, the bone analysis, and the potential link to the deceased maintenance worker. The sheriff called it an accidental discovery that answered questions long left open. He paused before adding, "Some questions we'll never be able to answer." As the cameras flashed, Evan stood in the back of the room, hands clasped, eyes lowered. He had seen the photographs. He had walked the same ground. And now, standing among the reporters and investigators, he couldn't stop thinking about that final image, the one from the Polaroid, where she'd been turning toward something just out of frame. Whatever had happened in those woods, it had stayed buried for nearly a decade and a half. The forest had kept her secret, but not forever. In the months that followed the discovery, the investigation wound down quietly. Reports were finalized, evidence cataloged, and for the first time in 14 years, the Mercer family had a place to bury what was left of their daughter. The Park Service arranged a private memorial at the Deep Creek trailhead that spring. It wasn't publicized, just a small circle of people who had been there since the beginning. The morning was clear but cool. Mist still lingered low across the valley, curling through the trees like breath. Daniel Mercer arrived early, walking slowly up the gravel road with a small box in his hands. Inside were Lila's belongings, returned by the authorities after testing was complete: her flannel shirt, the worn hiking pack, a bent metal clasp from her camera, and the locket that had brought her home. Each piece had been catalogued, photographed, and sealed in evidence bags, but now they were his again, damp, faded, and heavy with time. When the service began, a ranger read a short statement on behalf of the department, acknowledging the years of unanswered questions, the search teams that had never stopped hoping, and the bittersweet finality of the truth. A forensic analyst spoke briefly about how the environment had preserved her remains, how the cold, acidic soil of the Smokies slows decay, making it possible for something, even after years, to speak back from the silence. Evan stood at the edge of the group, listening. He had been asked to give the closing words, though he hadn't prepared anything formal. When it was his turn, he stepped forward and spoke simply. He told them what the evidence suggested, that Lila had likely slipped off trail near the creek, fracturing her leg in the fall. Disoriented, possibly in shock, she had wandered toward the old roadbed. There, she encountered someone who was never supposed to be in that part of the park. The maintenance worker's presence couldn't be proven beyond doubt, but the evidence and timing pointed in one direction. Evan believed the man had panicked. Maybe he thought she'd die before help arrived. Maybe he feared being blamed for negligence. In trying to hide what happened, he buried the truth instead. The locket, found years later, was a haunting gesture, an act of guilt or remembrance. It had been placed deliberately, perhaps by him, near the place she died. Experts later weighed in during follow-up interviews, debating what her case represented. Some argued it was a tragic misadventure, a sequence of bad decisions and worse luck. Others saw clear signs of foul play. Statistically, the vast majority of wilderness disappearances fall into the former category. People get lost, weather changes, accidents happen, but every so often, there's a case that refuses to fit that pattern, that carries something darker. The Great Smoky Mountains have seen hundreds of disappearances over the years. Some are resolved quickly, others remain unsolved decades later. A few, like Lila's, exist in the gray space between accident and intent. They remind investigators how fragile the line is between being found and being forgotten. After the ceremony, most attendees lingered in silence, unsure how to leave. Evan stayed behind as the crowd thinned. Daniel walked over and thanked him quietly, his voice steady but tired. He said he didn't blame the park, or the weather, or even the man who might have caused it. He just wanted to know what happened, and now he did. Before leaving, he placed the locket at the base of the trailhead sign, the same spot where he'd left flowers every October. That afternoon, the clouds began to thin. Sunlight broke through in narrow beams, cutting across the valley floor. The fog that had blanketed Deep Creek for most of the morning lifted, revealing the contours of the forest in sharp, golden detail. From the overlook above, the clearing where her remains had been found looked peaceful, quiet, almost undisturbed, as if the forest had settled back into itself. Evan watched the light shift across the trees and thought about the line from an old ranger's manual. The mountains don't take people. They just keep them until someone cares enough to look. For 14 years, the park had kept Lila's secret. It hadn't stolen her. It had just hidden the truth under layers of soil, roots, and time. That evening, Daniel made one last stop before driving home. He parked at the overlook facing the ridge and stood by the guardrail, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. The air smelled of rain and pine. In his hands, he held a small urn containing his daughter's ashes. He whispered something soft, almost lost to the wind, and then, as the last light touched the trees, he said, "I can finally take you home." He left soon after, the sun dipping behind the peaks, with the road winding down toward the town below. For Evan, the case stayed with him long after it closed. He filed reports, archived photos, and moved on to new assignments. But every year around late October, he'd drive back to Deep Creek. He'd park in the same lot and walk the first mile of trail before dusk. Sometimes he'd stop near the old foundation, where grass now covered most of the clearing, and stand there for a while. The forest was different, now quieter, lighter somehow. He never saw anything strange or heard anything out of place. But once, in 2021, while hiking alone after a light rain, He found a single wildflower growing beside the path, a mountain, aster, bright purple against the wet earth. It was the same flower Daniel used to leave every year. Evan left it there, untouched. In the end, there was nothing supernatural about what had happened to Lila Mercer. No vanishing lights, no cursed trail, no hidden dimension of the forest swallowing her whole. Just a chain of human mistakes, fear, and silence that lasted far too long. But still, something about her story lingered, something in the way the woods had held on to her for so many years, refusing to give her back until the right eyes looked in the right place. The case closed officially in 2019. Her father passed away 3 years later. His ashes were scattered along the same ridge where hers had been found. And now, when hikers pass through Deep Creek on clear mornings, they sometimes notice how still the air feels there, how the fog always seems to lift a little faster, how the sunlight lingers just a moment longer over the trees. Not a haunting, not a legend. Just what remains when a mystery finally exhales its last breath. Because in the Smokies, silence can hide the truth longer than time itself.